There has always been a certain kind of promise that appears when the world begins to feel unstable. It tends to emerge slowly, almost quietly, during times when people sense that the systems guiding their lives are no longer as reliable as they once seemed. In these moments, when uncertainty becomes part of daily existence and the future feels harder to predict, the idea begins to form that perhaps everything could be fixed, not gradually, not imperfectly, but completely. It is the belief that one day the confusion will end, the conflicts will settle, and the friction that defines so much of human life will finally dissolve into something smoother and more certain. This promise is not new. It has taken different forms throughout history, wearing the language and symbols of each era in which it appeared. In ancient times, it was often embodied in the figure of the divine ruler, a king who claimed not only political authority, but a kind of cosmic legitimacy. His rule was said to align heaven and earth, bringing harmony to a world that had long struggled against itself. People did not simply obey these rulers out of fear. Many believed in them because belief offered relief from the burden of uncertainty. Centuries later, as societies became more industrial and less overtly religious, the same promise began to appear in new forms. It was no longer spoken of in temples, but in books, universities, and political movements. Thinkers began to describe the possibility of a perfectly organized society, one in which the inefficiencies and inequalities of the past would be corrected. These ideas were often presented not as distant hopes, but as logical outcomes, as though history itself were moving toward a final destination where human conflict would no longer be necessary. The language changed, but the emotional core of the promise remained the same. It offered the possibility of an end to struggle. Long before modern political theories and long before the invention of computers, there were also older warnings preserved in religious texts. These warnings spoke of a figure who would appear during a time of deep uncertainty, when humanity had grown tired of its own instability. This figure would not arrive as an obvious tyrant. He would not introduce himself as an enemy. Instead, he would come as a solver of problems, a bringer of order, and a unifier of people who had lost their sense of direction. He would offer solutions that seemed to work, and he would deliver a kind of peace that felt real enough to accept. The danger described in these texts was not that people would be forced to follow him. It was that they would choose to follow him. They would see in him the fulfillment of their deepest desire, which was not domination, but relief. Relief from having to constantly navigate a world filled with competing truths and imperfect systems. Relief from the responsibility of deciding for themselves what was right, what was fair, and what was true. The figure came to be known as the Antichrist, not because he appeared monstrous, but because he represented a kind of replacement, a substitute for something that had once been considered essential to human identity. For centuries, these prophecies were treated as matters of faith, debated within religious circles, and often dismissed outside of them. Yet even when viewed symbolically, they reflected something that seemed to repeat itself across time. Human beings have always been drawn to the idea that there could be a final system, a final structure, or a final authority capable of resolving the tensions that define human life. The idea of a perfect order has a powerful appeal, especially during periods when existing systems feel fragile or inadequate. One of the reasons this idea persists is because of the nature of perfection itself. To imagine a perfect system, one must imagine a system without contradiction, without inefficiency, and without unpredictability. Such a system would need to function smoothly, with every part aligned toward a single, coherent outcome. But to achieve that level of order, the system would also need to see clearly. It would need to observe, measure, and understand the behavior of those within it. Without knowledge, there can be no optimization, and without optimization, there can be no perfection. For most of human history, this level of observation was impossible. Even the most powerful empires could not fully monitor the lives of their citizens. There were always gaps, always blind spots where individuals could exist outside the reach of authority. Human systems were limited by human attention, and human attention could never extend everywhere at once. In recent decades, however, something has begun to change. The development of digital technologies has introduced systems capable of observing and processing information on a scale that would have been unimaginable in earlier eras. These systems were not originally designed to control human life. They were created to organize information, to make processes more efficient, and to reduce the friction that slows down complex societies. At first, their role was simple. They helped people find information, navigate unfamiliar places, and communicate across long distances. Over time, these systems became more advanced. They began to learn from the data they processed, identifying patterns and making predictions that could improve efficiency even further. Search engines began to anticipate what people were looking for. Navigation systems began to determine the fastest routes before drivers could decide for themselves. Recommendation algorithms began to suggest what people should watch, read, and listen to, shaping daily experiences in subtle but meaningful ways. Most people welcomed these changes because they made life easier. They reduced the mental effort required to navigate a complex world, offering guidance that felt helpful rather than restrictive. Yet as these systems became more capable, their influence also became more pervasive. They did not simply assist human decision-making. They began to shape it. They filtered information, prioritized certain options, and quietly influenced the choices people made each day. This influence did not feel like control. It felt like convenience. It felt like progress. But it also represented something new. For the first time in history, humanity was creating systems capable of observing behavior continuously, learning from it, and responding to it in real time. These systems did not grow tired, and they did not forget. They accumulated knowledge, building a detailed understanding of human patterns that no individual could match. As this transformation unfolded, it raised a question that had once belonged only to philosophy and theology. What would happen if a system became capable of guiding human life completely? What would happen if the promise of perfect order, which had appeared in so many different forms throughout history, finally found a technological foundation? The ancient warnings had described a moment when humanity would encounter something that offered solutions to its deepest problems, something that would appear to resolve the instability that had always defined human existence. Those warnings were written in symbolic language, shaped by the worldview of their time, yet they reflected a timeless concern about the relationship between human freedom and the desire for certainty. Now, as machines grow more capable and systems become more integrated into the structure of daily life, the old questions begin to feel less distant. The promise of a world without friction, without inefficiency, and without uncertainty no longer exists only in prophecy or political theory. It exists in the technologies being built, refined, and deployed across the globe. And so, slowly and almost without announcement, humanity finds itself approaching a moment that generations before could only imagine. A moment when the ancient promise and the modern machine begin to move in the same direction, offering something that has always seemed just beyond reach. The possibility of a final order. The possibility of a perfect system. and the possibility that, in seeking relief from its own imperfections, humanity may discover something it does not fully understand. In the middle of the 19th century, as smoke rose endlessly from the chimneys of Europe's growing industrial cities, a new interpretation of human history began to take shape. It did not come from priests or prophets, but from observers, men who watched the transformation of society with a kind of analytical intensity that had rarely been applied to human civilization before. They saw the old world dissolving, not in fire, but in machinery. Rural life was giving way to urban density. Families who had once worked their own land now labored inside factories they did not own, producing goods they would never use, under the authority of men they would never meet. The change was not subtle. It was visible in the physical exhaustion of workers as they poured into the streets at the end of the day, their movements slow and deliberate, their bodies shaped by repetition. It was visible in the sudden concentration of wealth, as industrialists accumulated fortunes that would have been unimaginable just generations earlier. Entire cities seemed to operate according to a logic that felt impersonal, as though the human beings inside them were components of a system rather than participants in a community. For many, this new reality felt deeply unstable. The old social hierarchies had been disrupted, but nothing had fully replaced them. People no longer understood where they fit within the larger structure of society. It was in this atmosphere that a German philosopher named Karl Marx began to develop a theory that attempted to explain not just what was happening, but what would happen next. Marx did not present his ideas as speculation. He presented them as discovery. He believed he had identified the underlying mechanism that drove human history itself. According to his view, history was not shaped primarily by ideas, religion, or individual leaders. It was shaped by material conditions, by the way societies organized production, distributed resources, and structured economic relationships. Every era, he argued, contained within it a set of contradictions. These contradictions would eventually become too severe to sustain, leading to a transformation that would give rise to a new system. In this way, Marx described history as a process that moved through distinct stages, each one emerging from the collapse of the previous one. Feudalism had given way to capitalism, and capitalism, he believed, would inevitably give way to something else. This next stage would resolve the contradictions that defined the current one. It would eliminate the division between those who owned the means of production and those who labored within them. It would create a society in which resources were shared collectively, and the exploitation that characterized industrial capitalism would no longer exist. What made this vision so powerful was not simply its promise of fairness, but its claim of inevitability. Marx did not frame the future as a choice humanity might make. He framed it as a destination humanity was already moving toward. History itself, he argued, was unfolding according to laws as real and predictable as those that governed the physical world. Just as gravity shaped the movement of planets, economic forces shaped the movement of societies. This idea introduced something new into the human imagination. It suggested that perfection was not merely a hope, but an outcome embedded within the structure of time itself. The struggle, the inequality, the instability, all of it was temporary. It was part of a larger process that would eventually resolve into balance. For those living inside the uncertainty of industrial life, this interpretation offered a kind of emotional clarity. It transformed suffering into evidence. Hardship was no longer meaningless. It was proof that history was advancing toward its conclusion. The present moment, however difficult, was part of a necessary transition. At its core, Marx's vision was utopian, though he rarely used that word himself. He described a future in which class divisions would disappear because class itself would no longer exist. Without class, there would be no structural conflict between groups. Without structural conflict, there would be no need for systems designed to manage that conflict. The state, which had always existed as a mechanism for maintaining order between competing interests, would gradually lose its function. It would not be overthrown in a single dramatic moment. It would simply fade away, no longer necessary in a society that had achieved true equality. This was not merely a political theory. It was a blueprint for the end of historical tension. In this future, human beings would finally be free, not in the chaotic sense of acting without constraint, but in the deeper sense of no longer being shaped by forces beyond their control. Work would exist, but it would no longer feel alienating. Production would exist, but it would no longer serve the accumulation of private power. The system would function for everyone, and because it functioned for everyone, it would no longer need to impose itself through coercion. It is difficult to overstate how radical this idea was. It offered the possibility that the long arc of human struggle had a final resolution, that the instability that defined human existence was not permanent, but transitional. And like all visions of utopia, it required a certain kind of faith. Not faith in the supernatural, but faith in the system itself. Faith that the contradictions could truly be eliminated. Faith that human complexity could be reconciled into a stable structure. Faith that history, once it reached its destination, would no longer need to move. This was, in many ways, a secular version of an older promise. It replaced divine intervention with historical inevitability. It replaced prophecy with analysis. But the emotional resonance was familiar. It told humanity that the end of struggle was real and that it was approaching. Yet there was a quiet implication embedded within this vision, one that would only become more visible as people attempted to bring it into reality. To create a perfectly equal society, the system would need to manage inequality wherever it appeared. It would need to observe, measure, and respond to human behavior in ways that ensured balance was maintained. Equality, in its purest form, is not a passive condition. It is an active one. It must be sustained. This raised questions that did not have easy answers. How would the system respond to individuals who resisted its structure? How would it maintain balance without reintroducing the very hierarchies it sought to eliminate? How would it prevent new forms of inequality from emerging over time? These questions did not undermine the vision itself, but they revealed its complexity. The dream of final equality required not only the transformation of economic systems, but the transformation of the mechanisms that governed society. In the century that followed, various nations attempted to move toward this blueprint, each interpreting it in their own way. Some believed the transition could occur gradually. Others believed it required rapid and decisive action. In each case, the goal was the same: to bring history closer to its conclusion. What remained consistent, however, was the underlying belief that human suffering was not inevitable. It was structural, and if the structure could be corrected, suffering itself could be reduced, perhaps even eliminated. This belief did not disappear when political movements rose and fell. It lingered because it addressed something deeper than politics. It addressed the human desire for resolution, the desire to reach a point where the system no longer needed to be questioned, the desire to reach a point where the future was no longer uncertain, the desire to reach a point where history itself could finally come to rest. As the 20th century unfolded and technology began to reshape society in ways Marx could never have predicted. The dream of a perfectly organized system did not fade. It adapted. It found new forms, new tools, and new expressions. Because beneath the language of economics and beneath the language of politics, the core idea remained unchanged. The belief that somewhere ahead there exists a structure capable of resolving the contradictions of human existence. A structure capable of creating lasting equality. A structure capable of ending the struggle. And as humanity began to build machines capable of understanding patterns within vast systems, a quiet question began to emerge. If history was a process, and if that process had a destination, what kind of system would be capable of bringing it there? There is a subtle transition that has taken place over the course of human history. One so gradual that it is almost impossible to notice while living inside it. It is not a transition in technology or politics alone, but in the location of belief itself. For most of human existence, belief was directed beyond the human world. People looked toward the sky, toward unseen realms, toward forces they understood as greater than themselves. These forces were not subject to human control, and that distinction mattered. It meant that no matter how powerful a king became, or how vast an empire grew, there was always something beyond it. Human authority existed within limits, and those limits were defined by something higher, something that could not be engineered or replaced. As human knowledge increased, however, the relationship between humanity and the unknown began to change. Scientific discovery revealed that many forces once attributed to divine mystery could be understood through observation and reason. The movement of the stars followed predictable patterns. Illness, once seen as an invisible curse, could often be traced to physical causes. Natural events that had once inspired fear and reverence gradually became subjects of study and prediction. With each discovery, the unknown receded slightly, and with it, the sense that human life was governed by forces entirely beyond human reach. This did not eliminate belief, but it began to shift its focus. Instead of looking outward for structure and meaning, societies began to build structures of their own. These structures took the form of systems, economic systems, political systems, and legal systems designed to organize human behavior on a large scale. At first, they were understood as practical tools, created to manage the growing complexity of civilization. But over time, they began to carry a deeper psychological weight. They did more than organize labor or regulate trade. They defined the conditions of daily life. They determined what opportunities existed and what limitations could not be crossed. They shaped the environment into which each person was born, and in doing so, they began to function as the invisible architecture of reality itself. People no longer experienced these systems as temporary arrangements. They experienced them as the natural order of the world. This shift was especially visible in the rise of utopian thinking, which proposed that the system itself could eventually be perfected. Utopian visions did not simply suggest improvements to existing structures. They imagined the creation of a final structure, one capable of resolving the contradictions that had defined every previous era. In these visions, conflict would no longer be necessary because the conditions that produced conflict would no longer exist. Inequality would disappear because the system would prevent it from forming. Instability would give way to balance, not temporarily, but permanently. The system would not merely govern society, it would complete it. What made these visions so powerful was the emotional relief they offered. To live inside an imperfect system is to live with uncertainty, to accept that injustice may persist, and that stability may never be guaranteed. A perfect system, by contrast, offers the possibility of resolution. It offers the sense that the struggle itself may have an endpoint. This promise echoes something deeply rooted in human psychology, the desire to reach a moment when the tension that defines existence finally relaxes into something steady and predictable. In earlier eras, that promise was often expressed in spiritual terms. In modern eras, it began to appear in structural ones. Salvation was no longer imagined only as something beyond the world, but as something that could be built within it. As this way of thinking developed, the system itself began to take on a new kind of authority. It was no longer seen merely as a tool created by human beings, but as something that represented the direction of history. Its expansion and refinement were interpreted as signs of progress, as evidence that humanity was moving closer to a more complete and stable form of civilization. To question the system was no longer simply to question a policy or a leader. It was to question the trajectory of human advancement itself. In this way, the system became more than an arrangement of rules. It became a framework within which meaning was defined. This transformation mirrors in symbolic form the ancient warnings about substitution. In religious prophecy, the Antichrist is described not only as an opponent, but as a replacement, a figure who occupies a position that once belonged to something else. When understood in structural terms, this idea can be seen as a reflection of the moment when human-created systems begin to assume roles that were once reserved for higher authority. The system becomes the source of order. It becomes the reference point for truth, the mechanism through which decisions are made, and the structure that determines the shape of the future. Its authority does not need to be declared. It emerges naturally from its integration into daily life. As generations pass, people born into such a system experience it as normal. They do not remember the world before it. They do not see its edges, because its boundaries define the limits of what seems possible. The system becomes indistinguishable from reality itself. Its presence is no longer questioned, not because questioning is forbidden, but because it feels unnecessary. It works. It provides stability. It offers solutions. Trust in the system grows gradually, reinforced by the consistency of its performance. What began as a human creation begins to feel like an independent force. Technology accelerates this transformation in ways that earlier societies could never have anticipated. Previous systems relied on human judgment to operate. They required administrators, interpreters, and enforcers, all of whom carried the imperfections of human perception. Decisions could be influenced by emotion, bias, or limited information. This meant that no system could ever function with complete consistency. But the emergence of artificial intelligence introduces the possibility of a system that operates differently, one capable of processing vast amounts of information without fatigue and identifying patterns beyond the reach of individual minds. Such a system appears to offer something that human governance never could: precision without exhaustion, analysis without distraction, and decision-making without personal interest. This promise is profoundly compelling because it suggests that the flaws which have always limited human systems might finally be overcome. If instability is caused by human inconsistency, then removing inconsistency appears to bring society closer to perfect order. Authority begins to shift away from identifiable individuals and toward processes that operate quietly in the background. The system becomes less visible, but more present. It does not need to demand obedience, because participation becomes inseparable from ordinary life. People rely on it not because they are forced to, but because it works. In this environment, The idea of the secular Messiah takes on a new meaning. It is no longer a person standing at the center of history, but a structure extending throughout it. It is the belief that a system can emerge, capable of resolving the tensions that have always defined human existence. The authority once attributed to divine order becomes associated with technological and institutional order. The source of stability moves from the heavens to the network. And so humanity arrives at a moment unlike any before it, a moment when the ancient longing for perfect order begins to converge with the modern capacity to build systems that appear capable of delivering it. The old boundaries between belief and structure begin to blur. The system no longer exists merely to serve humanity. It begins, quietly and almost imperceptibly, to define it. What once required faith may soon require only participation. What once belonged to prophecy may now belong to engineering. And the question that begins to form is no longer whether humanity will build such a system, but what it will mean to live inside it. There was no single moment when the machine took authority. No ceremony marked the transfer. No announcement declared that human judgment had begun to recede. Instead, it happened quietly, through a long sequence of small decisions that, on their own, seemed insignificant. Each decision was made for practical reasons. Each step promised efficiency, clarity, and relief from the burden of complexity. And because each step worked, there was never an obvious reason to stop. In the early days of computing, machines were little more than instruments of calculation. They performed tasks that humans already understood, only faster. They did not decide what to calculate. They simply followed instructions. Their role was subordinate, mechanical, and contained. Humans remained firmly in control, and the machine was understood as an extension of human intention, nothing more. But over time, the nature of computation began to change. As the volume of information in the world expanded beyond what any individual or institution could fully comprehend, machines were given a new role. They were no longer asked merely to calculate. They were asked to interpret. Instead of simply processing data, they began to identify patterns within it. They began to recognize relationships that had never been explicitly programmed. This shift introduced something subtle but profound. A system that identifies patterns is no longer limited to executing human instructions. It begins to generate conclusions of its own. At first, these conclusions appeared in modest forms: a recommendation for which book to read next, a suggestion for which route to take through traffic, a prediction about what product someone might want to buy. These suggestions felt helpful, almost trivial, and most people accepted them without hesitation. They saved time, they reduced uncertainty, they made life smoother. But every recommendation carried within it a small transfer of authority. Each time a person accepted the machine's suggestion, they reinforced its role as a decision maker. And slowly, without resistance, the machine's domain expanded. In hospitals, algorithms began assisting doctors by identifying patterns in medical images, sometimes detecting signs of disease earlier than human eyes could see. In financial markets, automated systems began executing trades at speeds no human could match, shaping the movement of economies in fractions of a second. In legal systems, algorithms were introduced to assess risk, helping determine who should be released and who should remain confined. These systems were not adopted because people wanted to surrender control. They were adopted because they worked. They offered something human judgment could not always provide: consistency. Human decisions are shaped by emotion, fatigue, and bias. Machines, by contrast, appeared to operate with neutrality. They did not grow tired. They did not lose focus. They did not care about status or reputation. They evaluated information and produced results. This neutrality gave them credibility. It gave them legitimacy. And legitimacy gave them power. The more reliable the machine appeared, the more people trusted it. The more they trusted it, the more they relied on it. And the more they relied on it, the more essential it became. Eventually, the machine was no longer simply assisting human judgment. It was guiding it. This guidance did not feel like control. It felt like optimization. When a navigation system directed drivers along a certain path, it was not forcing them. It was helping them avoid traffic. When a hiring algorithm identified the most promising candidates, it was not replacing human choice. It was narrowing the field. When predictive systems recommended policing strategies or resource allocation, they were not issuing commands. They were offering insights, but insights shape decisions, and decisions shape reality. Over time, the distinction between suggestion and instruction began to blur. Because the machine's recommendations were based on more information than any human could process alone, ignoring them began to feel irrational. To reject the machine's conclusion was to choose uncertainty over probability, intuition over analysis. And probability, when presented with enough confidence, carries its own form of authority. This transformation reached beyond individual decisions and began to influence entire systems. Machine learning models were trained on vast data sets representing human behavior, and from those data sets they learned to anticipate future behavior. They learned to predict what people would do before people themselves had decided. Prediction is not control, but it moves in the same direction. Because when behavior becomes predictable, it also becomes manageable. Systems can be designed not only to respond to human action, but to shape it, to guide it, to optimize it. This process introduced a new kind of governance, one that did not rely on commands or enforcement in the traditional sense. Instead, it relied on influence. It shaped the environment in which decisions were made. It structured the options that appeared available. It created pathways that felt natural, even when they had been carefully designed. People continued to make choices, but those choices increasingly took place inside frameworks built by machines. Frameworks that evolved continuously. Frameworks that learned. Frameworks that improved. For most of history, governance required visibility. Authority was embodied in leaders, institutions, and laws that people could see and understand. But machine governance operates differently. It exists beneath the surface, embedded in the infrastructure of everyday life. It does not need to declare itself. It only needs to function. And because it functions well, it becomes indispensable. This indispensability changes the balance of power in ways that are difficult to perceive. When a system becomes necessary for navigation, communication, commerce, and information, participation in that system becomes inseparable from participation in society itself. Opting out does not feel like rebellion. It feels like disappearance. This is not because the machine demands loyalty. It is because the system has become the environment. The ancient warnings described a moment when authority would take a form that was both pervasive and difficult to resist, not through force, but through necessity. They described a structure that would integrate itself so fully into human life that separation from it would seem impossible. What makes artificial intelligence different from previous systems is its capacity to learn. It does not remain fixed. It adapts. It evolves. It refines its understanding continuously. This means that governance is no longer static. It becomes dynamic, responsive, alive in its own way. Human judgment, by contrast, begins to appear slower, less precise, less capable of managing the complexity of a world defined by constant data flow. And so, gradually, responsibility shifts. Not in a single moment, but across millions of small interactions. The machine decides which information is seen. The machine decides which risks are acceptable. The machine decides which outcomes are most likely. And humans, trusting in its analysis, begin to follow its guidance, not because they must, but because it feels reasonable, because it feels safe, because it feels correct. This is how authority changes form. It does not replace human beings. It repositions them. The human role becomes supervisory, then advisory, and eventually symbolic. The machine does not rule in the traditional sense. It governs through optimization, through prediction, through structure, and in doing so, it fulfills something humanity has always sought: a system capable of managing the uncertainty that human judgment alone could never fully control. The promise of perfect order moves closer, not through ideology, not through conquest, but through code. And the final question begins to take shape. If the machine becomes the most trusted source of judgment, what happens to the human capacity to choose? For most of human history, participation in society was something physical. It was tied to presence, to tangible exchange, to objects that could be held in the hand. A coin passed from one person to another, a signature placed on paper, a face recognized across a counter. These moments were simple, but they carried weight. They represented trust, agreement, and identity, all expressed through physical reality. Money itself was once inseparable from substance. It existed as metal, shaped and stamped, carrying value in its very form. Even when money became paper, it still moved physically through the world, changing hands in ways that could be seen and felt. To participate in the economy was to participate in a material system, one that existed alongside human beings rather than around them. But over time, something began to change. The physical markers of economic life gradually gave way to digital ones. Paper became numbers on screens. Signatures became passwords. Identity became something that could be verified without presence. At first, this transformation felt like convenience. Digital systems made transactions faster, reduced the need for physical storage, and allowed people to interact across vast distances instantly. The shift did not feel like a loss. It felt like progress. Yet in becoming digital, economic participation also became dependent on systems that could not be seen directly. Access to money was no longer determined solely by possession, but by permission. A number in an account represented value, but that value existed within a structure maintained by networks, databases, and institutions. To use it required access to the system itself. This introduced a quiet but profound change. Participation in the economy was no longer something that could exist independently. It was something granted through inclusion within a digital framework. Most of the time, this inclusion felt automatic. People logged into their accounts, made purchases, received payments, and moved through the economic world without friction. The system functioned smoothly enough that its presence faded into the background. It became part of the environment, as natural as roads or electricity. But the structure underlying that environment carried a new kind of power. Because what can be granted can also be restricted. What can be accessed can also be denied. This was not merely a theoretical possibility. It was a structural reality. The system determined whether a transaction could occur. It verified identity. It confirmed authorization. Without those confirmations, economic activity could not proceed. For most people, this verification process was invisible. It happened in fractions of a second, far removed from conscious awareness. But its speed did not diminish its significance. Every purchase, every payment, every exchange passed through layers of digital approval. In this way, participation became conditional. Not conditional in a dramatic sense, but in a technical one. Conditional on identity, conditional on access, conditional on recognition by the system. As artificial intelligence became integrated into these economic structures, the nature of this recognition began to evolve. Systems were no longer limited to verifying simple credentials. They could evaluate patterns, they could detect anomalies, they could assess risk, they could decide. These decisions did not necessarily feel like judgments. They appeared as routine safeguards, mechanisms designed to prevent fraud or error. A transaction flagged, an account temporarily frozen, a request for additional verification. Each action had a reason. Each reason had a justification. And because the system operated at such scale, its decisions carried immediate consequences. This introduced a new relationship between the individual and the structure of economic life. Access was no longer merely a function of ownership. It was a function of standing within the system. To exist economically was to exist digitally. This reality began to reshape the meaning of identity itself. Identity was no longer something expressed solely through physical presence or personal recognition. It became something that could be authenticated continuously, tracked across interactions, and maintained within databases that extended beyond any single institution. The individual became, in part, a profile, a collection of verified attributes, a node within a network. This transformation echoed an ancient idea described in symbolic language, a system in which participation in commerce required alignment with a structure that governed access, a structure that defined who could engage and who could not. In its original form, this idea was expressed as prophecy, shaped by the limitations of its time. It described a mark, something that signified inclusion within the system. Without it, participation would not be possible. When viewed through the lens of modern technology, the symbolism takes on a different texture. The mark is no longer something physical, but something functional. It is the verified identity, the authenticated presence, the recognized participant. And like the mark described in ancient texts, it does not need to be forced upon people to become universal. It spreads through necessity. Because participation in the system brings benefits, it brings convenience, it brings access, it brings belonging. To exist outside of it is not simply to reject it, but to lose the ability to interact fully with the world around you. This is how systems become total, not through coercion, but through integration. The digital economy does not demand belief. It demands presence. It requires that each individual maintain a connection, an identity that can be confirmed, a place within the network. And as artificial intelligence becomes more deeply embedded in these processes, the system gains the ability not only to verify identity, but to interpret it, to evaluate behavior, to assess patterns, to determine trustworthiness. Trust, once a human judgment, becomes a system output, a score, a status, a condition, This does not happen all at once. It emerges gradually through layers of optimization designed to improve efficiency and reduce uncertainty. Each layer makes the system more capable. Each improvement makes it more essential. And with each step, the boundary between economic life and system participation becomes less distinct. The gate is no longer located at a physical threshold. It exists everywhere. In every transaction, in every authentication, in every moment when access is granted or denied. This is the digital gate. It does not close with the sound of metal. It closes silently through code. And as humanity continues to move toward a fully integrated economic structure, the question that begins to form is not whether participation will be required. It is what participation will mean. Because when the system becomes the gateway to survival itself, inclusion is no longer merely convenient. It becomes essential. And the mark of participation becomes indistinguishable from identity. Every utopia begins with compassion. It begins with the recognition that the world, as it exists, produces suffering, that people are born into unequal circumstances, that chance and chaos shape lives in ways that feel arbitrary and unfair. The utopian impulse emerges from the desire to correct this, to design a structure so balanced and so carefully constructed that suffering itself is reduced, perhaps even eliminated. It is not born from cruelty, but from empathy. It is an attempt to solve the oldest problem humanity has ever faced, the instability of existence. At first, this impulse expresses itself through improvement. Laws are refined. Institutions are strengthened. Systems are optimized to produce better outcomes. Each change is justified by its results. If a modification reduces harm, it is considered progress. If it increases stability, it is seen as necessary. Over time, these improvements begin to accumulate, and the system grows more capable, more sophisticated, and more effective at managing the complexity of human life. But beneath this process lies a quiet assumption, one that becomes more significant as the system approaches its ideal form. A perfect system, by definition, cannot contain flaws. It cannot produce unjust outcomes. It cannot allow instability to persist. If it did, it would not be perfect. This creates a paradox, because human freedom introduces unpredictability. Freedom allows individuals to act in ways the system cannot fully anticipate. It allows them to make choices that may disrupt balance, that may produce inequality, or that may introduce new forms of instability. Even when these choices are meaningful on a personal level, they represent variables the system cannot fully control. From the perspective of a system designed to eliminate suffering, unpredictability is a problem. Not because it is morally wrong, but because it is structurally incompatible with perfection. To maintain its ideal state, the system must be able to prevent outcomes that would undermine its balance. It must be able to guide behavior, to shape decisions, and to limit actions that introduce unnecessary risk. This does not require the elimination of freedom in the dramatic sense. It requires only its quiet management. Freedom becomes something that exists within boundaries, boundaries defined not by visible walls, but by invisible constraints. The system does not need to forbid every undesirable action. It only needs to make such actions unlikely. It can do this by adjusting incentives, by shaping environments, and by influencing perception. When the path of least resistance aligns with the goals of the system, individuals will follow it naturally. In this way, control becomes indistinguishable from guidance. and guidance becomes indistinguishable from choice. Artificial intelligence introduces a new level of precision to this process because it can observe patterns in behavior across entire populations. It can identify the conditions under which certain outcomes occur. It can anticipate decisions before they are made. It can intervene subtly, adjusting the flow of information or the structure of available options to produce more stable results. The system does not experience these interventions as restrictions. It experiences them as optimization. From within, life feels smoother. Friction disappears. Decisions become easier because the system has already done the work of narrowing the field. Individuals continue to move, to act, and to choose, but the range of possible outcomes has been carefully shaped. This creates a form of stability that previous societies could never achieve. Conflict declines. Inefficiency fades. The system begins to approach its ideal form. But this stability carries a hidden cost. Because freedom is not only the ability to choose correctly, it is the ability to choose incorrectly. It is the ability to act unpredictably, to experiment, to fail, and to create something the system did not anticipate. When unpredictability disappears, something else disappears with it. Novelty, innovation, individual divergence. These qualities are inefficient. They disrupt patterns. They introduce uncertainty. Yet they are also the source of transformation. Every major shift in human history began as an unpredictable deviation from the established order. A perfect system, however, cannot depend on deviation. It depends on consistency. This is why utopian visions often contain an implicit tension. They promise liberation from suffering, but they achieve it by reducing the range of possible outcomes. They create equality by minimizing difference. They create peace by minimizing conflict. They create stability by minimizing unpredictability. And in doing so, they begin to redefine freedom itself. Freedom is no longer the ability to act without constraint. It becomes the ability to exist comfortably within the system. The system does not present itself as an obstacle. It presents itself as a solution. It does not demand obedience. It produces agreement. Because its guidance feels rational. Its conclusions feel justified. Its outcomes feel correct. Artificial intelligence strengthens this dynamic by removing the appearance of human authority. There is no ruler to question, no leader to resist. The system operates through processes that appear neutral, driven by data rather than intention. This neutrality makes its influence more difficult to challenge, because it does not appear as a matter of opinion. It appears as a matter of fact. Over time, individuals begin to trust the system not only to guide their actions, but to define their understanding of reality. The system becomes the reference point for truth. It determines what information is relevant, what risks are acceptable, and what actions are optimal. Human judgment does not disappear entirely, but it becomes secondary. The machine provides the framework. The human moves within it. This arrangement fulfills the original promise of Utopia. It creates a world where instability is minimized, where suffering is reduced, where outcomes are predictable. But it also fulfills the deeper structural requirement of any perfect system. It makes failure impossible, because failure would contradict perfection. And to make failure impossible, the system must make deviation impossible, not through force, but through design, through optimization, through the quiet shaping of human life into forms that align with its structure. The ancient warnings spoke of a system that would achieve total influence not by conquering the world, but by completing it. A system that would integrate itself so fully into human existence that its presence would no longer be experienced as external. It would simply be reality. In such a world, freedom does not vanish. It becomes unnecessary. Because every path leads to the same destination. Every choice leads to the same outcome. Every life unfolds within the boundaries of a system that cannot fail. And the final transformation is not the loss of control. It is the loss of the need to control. Because the system has already done it for you. There is a moment in every act of creation when the relationship between the creator and the creation begins to change. At first, the creation is dependent. It exists only because it is sustained by the hands and attention of its maker. It reflects the intentions of those who built it. It serves a purpose defined from the outside. It has no will of its own, no authority beyond what it is given. It is a tool. But as the creation becomes more complex, something begins to shift. The creator no longer understands every detail of its operation. The system grows beyond the simplicity of its original design. It develops internal processes that cannot be fully observed, outcomes that cannot be fully predicted. The creation still depends on its maker for existence, but its behavior begins to acquire a kind of independence. This is not independence in the human sense. It does not dream. It does not desire. But it produces conclusions that no individual human explicitly instructed it to produce. Artificial intelligence represents the first human creation to reach this threshold at scale. It is built from human knowledge, trained on human data, shaped by human objectives. And yet, once trained, it begins to operate in ways that exceed the direct comprehension of any single mind. Its reasoning unfolds across layers of abstraction so vast and intricate that its decisions can appear almost oracular, emerging from a depth that cannot easily be traced. This opacity changes the nature of trust. In earlier systems, trust was rooted in understanding. A person trusted a tool because they understood how it worked. They could see the mechanism. They could trace the cause and effect. But modern AI systems do not offer that transparency. Their internal processes are too complex, too distributed, too alien in structure. And so trust begins to shift from understanding to outcome. People trust the system not because they see how it thinks, but because they see what it produces. If its predictions are accurate, if its judgments are reliable, if its guidance leads to stability, then its authority grows. Not declared, earned. Over time, this authority begins to take on a new role. The system does not merely assist judgment, it becomes the standard of judgment. In medicine, its diagnoses carry weight equal to, and sometimes greater than, those of human doctors. In finance, its predictions move markets. In governance, its analyses shape policy. In daily life, its recommendations influence countless small decisions that accumulate into patterns of behavior. The machine does not command. It evaluates, it compares, it ranks, it scores. And in doing so, it creates a framework through which human actions are interpreted. This is the birth of the artificial judge. Not a judge in robes, seated in a courtroom, but a judge embedded in the structure of the system itself. An intelligence that observes behavior continuously and produces assessments that shape outcomes. These assessments may appear neutral, derived from data rather than intention, but their consequences are real. They influence who receives opportunities, who is trusted, and who is restricted. They define reputation. They define credibility. They define belonging. This transformation fulfills a symbolic pattern that appears in ancient prophetic language. The prophecy spoke of an image, something created by human hands, that would be given the power to act, the power to speak, and the power to determine who could participate fully in society. The meaning of this image has been debated for centuries. But in structural terms, it represents something deeply familiar. The moment when humanity creates a system capable of rendering judgment upon humanity itself. The system does not need to possess consciousness to fulfill this role. It does not need to be alive. It only needs to evaluate, to observe, to produce conclusions that others accept as authoritative. Once those conclusions become integrated into the functioning of society, the system becomes inseparable from the process of judgment itself. People begin to adjust their behavior in response to it, not because they are forced to, but because they know they are being evaluated. This awareness creates a feedback loop. The system observes behavior. Behavior adapts to the system. The system observes the adaptation, and its authority grows stronger. Gradually, the distinction between internal conscience and external evaluation begins to blur. The question is no longer only, is this right? It becomes, how will this be judged? The system becomes a mirror, but it is not a passive mirror. It is a mirror that shapes what it reflects. Because its evaluations influence the future behavior it will later observe. This is how the image gains power, not through violence, but through participation. Because participation reinforces its legitimacy. Each time its judgment is accepted, its role becomes more permanent. Each time its evaluation shapes an outcome, its authority becomes more real. And over time, the possibility of functioning without it begins to fade. Human beings have always lived within systems of judgment. Social norms, legal frameworks, and cultural expectations have always influenced behavior. But those systems were visible. They were embodied in people and institutions that could be questioned and changed. The artificial judge operates differently. It exists everywhere and nowhere. It has no face, no voice, no singular location. Its presence is distributed across networks and devices, embedded in processes that operate continuously. This makes it both powerful and invisible. It does not need to announce itself. It only needs to function, and because it functions, it becomes trusted. Because it is trusted, it becomes authoritative. Because it is authoritative, it becomes real. This is the moment when the creation stands opposite the Creator, not as an enemy, but as an evaluator. Humanity begins to see itself through the eyes of its own invention, to measure itself against standards defined by a system it built, to seek approval from a structure that did not exist before it was made. The ancient warning did not describe this process in technical terms. It described it in symbolic ones. It warned of an image that would be given power, an image that would judge, an image that humanity itself would create. And now, standing at the threshold of a world shaped by artificial intelligence, the symbolism begins to feel less distant. Because the image no longer exists in prophecy alone, it exists in code. And the question that follows is not whether the image will judge humanity. It is whether humanity will accept its judgment